From the first guarded rites in ancient temples to the locked doors of modern lodges, secrecy has served as a tool, a refuge, and a magnet for suspicion. The idea that chosen insiders share signs, vows, and teachings gives ordinary groups an aura of power that often exceeds their actual reach. Every age produces its own version, whether a circle of philosophers guarding difficult truths or a fraternity promising mutual aid and advancement. People join for belonging, belief, knowledge, or advantage, and those motives rarely travel alone. What follows traces how secret societies grew, adapted, and left marks on faith, politics, charity, and myth without assuming that hidden masters control every string. Before we continue, please like the video and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. Your support helps us keep bringing deep history to this community. What counts as a secret society? Start with a definition that is practical rather than mystical. A secret society is a selective group that requires initiation, binds members by oath, and transmits teachings or privileges through controlled signs, grades, or narratives that are not available to everyone. Some of these groups protect sacred or technical knowledge, some coordinate action that could attract punishment, and some cultivate prestige through exclusivity. The defining elements are limited access, ritualized entry, and shared signals that allow members to recognize one another beyond ordinary introductions. Without those elements, a circle may be private, but it is not truly secret in the historical sense. Look closely at the role of ritual, because ceremony turns a collection of names into a body with memory. Initiation is not simply a test, it is a story lived through the body that convinces the initiate that they have crossed a threshold. Pledges, tokens, passwords, and narratives do heavy work by making the group feel ancient, even when it is new. Once an individual has sworn and learned the first signals, they can be trusted with further instruction and practical favors. That layered pathway helps the society filter applicants and bind them through shared experience, rather than mere promises. Consider also the social technology of secrecy. Exclusive groups manipulate information to shape status and loyalty, which is why even modest fraternities often develop grades and inner circles. An outer ring may enjoy fellowship and simple signs, while higher degrees receive deeper lore or strategic knowledge. The people who administer the gates gain influence inside the group and sometimes outside it. Outsiders respond to that structure with a mix of curiosity and anxiety, since the sight of a closed door often suggests both danger and value. Motives for secrecy vary across time, but tend to cluster around familiar pressures. Persecution forces believers and reformers to hide, competition encourages professionals to guard techniques, and inequality pushes ambitious people to seek networks that promise help. Sacredness itself can justify silence, since many religions teach that holy things require veils. A society that began as a refuge can grow into a status ladder, and a club born to protect a trade can evolve into a charity. This flexibility explains why a single definition has to leave room for change. Finally, remember that secrecy breeds stories. Neighbors who lack access will imagine what happens inside, and those tales can harden into accusations or legends. A small ritual can be recast as a plot, and a study circle can be painted as a cabal. The history of secret societies is therefore also a history of rumor and fear, which means careful readers must sort method from myth at each step. That sorting is the task that frames the rest of this journey. 2500 BC, ancient Near Eastern priesthoods and guarded rites. Temple cities of the ancient Near East organized knowledge behind walls long before the word fraternity existed. Priests managed calendars, offerings, and measurements that governed harvests and taxes, and the ability to read sacred signs granted both religious and administrative power. Access to the inner rooms of a temple meant access to details that shaped the life of a city, from festival dates to omens. Ordinary people saw the outer procession and heard public hymns, but the procedures that kept the gods satisfied unfolded away from most eyes. This separation taught generations to associate hidden procedures with cosmic order. Guardianship of ritual knowledge was not only about mystery, it was also about stability. If a priesthood claimed that a rite had to be performed in a certain sequence with precise words, then only trained insiders could guarantee success. That claim created a market for instruction and a gate for authority. When new dynasties rose or foreign rulers took control, the continuity of a priestly class helped legitimize the change. Secrets were therefore less about thrill and more about preserving a pattern that made daily life predictable for rulers and farmers alike. Cuneiform tablets and temple archives reveal how specialized this knowledge became. Lists of omens, astronomical observations, and sacrificial recipes turned tradition into a library that only trained scribes could use. Apprenticeship systems developed to pass on these skills, and those who advanced joined a community defined as much by method as by belief. The ability to consult a text and interpret its demands gave these scribal circles a shared identity, one that resembled later esoteric schools that treat written lore as a treasure to be guarded and decoded. Secrecy carried practical benefits in a world where divine favor justified power. A ruler who could say that the high priest had read favorable signs gained legitimacy, and a priest who could claim access to the will of the gods gained protection. When droughts or defeats struck, control of explanations mattered as much as control of grain. By managing which texts and interpretations reached the public, temple elites managed expectations and dampened panic. The quiet room behind the sanctuary became a factory of meaning. There is also a human side that deserves attention. Secrecy can create a sense of purpose among those who carry it, and that purpose tightens bonds under stress. Young initiates learn not only words and gestures, but also the feeling of being part of a trusted circle. That feeling does not end when one leaves the sanctuary. It colors family pride and civic loyalty. Out of those emotions grows a pattern that echoes across time, where guarded knowledge becomes the glue that holds a community through flood and war. 1300 BC Egyptian mysteries and the aura of hidden wisdom. Egyptian religion developed layers of teaching that later generations would romanticize as the source of primordial wisdom. Initiation into temple service required learning sequences, hymns, and taboos that the public revered but did not see. Festivals presented myths in dazzling processions, yet the inner logic of the rites remained the domain of trained officiants. The boundary between seen and unseen gave Egyptian practice an air of depth that intrigued foreign visitors and inspired later philosophical tales. Even when later writers projected fantasies onto Egypt, they drew on a real structure where some things were meant for the inner circle. Mortuary beliefs amplified that aura. The journey of the soul through tests and gates made secrecy part of the cosmic script. Spells in funerary texts addressed guardians who required correct names and answers, and that scene mirrored the social gatekeeping of priestly life. When a tradition teaches that salvation depends on knowing the right words in the right order, the custodians of that knowledge naturally acquire special status. The connection between initiation on earth and passage in the afterlife gave Egyptian secrecy a gravity that still resonates. Contact with foreign cultures multiplied the echoes. Greeks who traveled in Egypt during later centuries found a landscape dense with symbols and a clergy proud of long memory. Some Greek authors credited Egypt with ancient revelations, and later Hermetic writings imagined wise figures who disclosed hidden truths to worthy students. The reality inside Egyptian temples was more practical and local than those later legends, but the romance of hidden Nile wisdom became a powerful story in its own right. That romance would feed many European esoteric currents long after the temples fell silent. The discipline required of Egyptian initiates also models a broader pattern. To belong to a sacred circle is to submit to a rhythm of purity, silence, and precision that marks one off from everyday life. Such training produces a sense of transformation that outsiders can detect even if they do not know the details. People can tell when a neighbor has taken on a new seriousness or speaks with the calm of someone who knows a secret. The change in bearing becomes proof that the hidden instruction is worth seeking. What lingers from Egypt in the story of secret societies is less a single doctrine and more a set of expectations. Esoteric groups promise that truth is layered, that the worthy will be tested, and that correct practice has power. They also suggest that belonging to a chain of trained people connects one to a past that dignifies the present. Those expectations travel easily across centuries, and they shape how later fraternities describe their own missions and rites, even when their goals are secular. 500 BC Greek mystery religions, Eleusis and the Orphics. Classical Greece hosted public cults alongside private mysteries that promised blessings for initiates. The Eleusinian rites near Athens are the best-known example, drawing seekers who accepted vows of silence in exchange for participation in a drama of loss and return. The content of the vision at the heart of Eleusis remained veiled for centuries, not because authorities hunted the group, but because the experience was defined by restraint. To keep a rite unspoken is to preserve its power, and that belief allowed the mysteries to thrive inside a free city. Orphic groups layered musical and poetic practices onto teachings about the soul. They offered rules for purity and stories that framed human life as capable of renewal through discipline and remembrance. These circles were small, uneven, and varied, yet they demonstrated how Greek culture made space for unofficial paths to meaning. A person could honor civic gods in public and seek a more intimate solace through private initiation. That balance between openness and reserve created a template for many later societies that operate beside official faiths rather than against them. Secrecy in the Greek mysteries did not isolate the initiates from the wider community. Membership conferred social recognition and sometimes prestige because participation signaled seriousness and cultural refinement. Public figures could attend without scandal, and the mysteries themselves were woven into calendars and travel plans. That integration shows how secrecy can be respectable when it serves a recognized higher good rather than subversion. In that setting, the vow of silence functioned less as a wall and more as a veil that promised reverent surprise. The Greek case highlights a lesson about knowledge and feeling. Initiates did not collect rare facts so much as they received an experience framed by story and symbol. The secret was not a list, but a moment of encounter that changed how the world looked afterward. Many later societies will claim that their rituals work in the same way, shifting perception and strengthening courage without needing to reveal a long book of hidden propositions. That approach makes secrecy less brittle because it depends on memory and meaning rather than on a cache of information that could be copied. When the classical world turned toward new philosophies and imperial structures, the mysteries adapted or faded, yet their method remained influential. A small circle, a vow of silence, a promise of benefit in this life and the next, and a lore that deepens with repeated participation all survived the fall of city-states. In that endurance lies the subtle power of the Greek model, which proved that private rites could support public virtue while satisfying personal hunger for depth. 530 BC Pythagoreans as a disciplined brotherhood. The followers of Pythagoras built a community that fused mathematics, ethics, and initiation into a distinct way of life. Those who lived within the circle took on dietary rules, communal property, and graded instruction that advanced through silence and obedience. The teaching linked number to harmony and suggested that the structure of the cosmos could shape character. Members learned signs and phrases that allowed recognition across regions and generations. A school became a brotherhood, and a brotherhood became a model for later groups that mix philosophy with ritual. At the heart of the Pythagorean practice stood a training in restraint. Novices observed a period of quiet in which they listened more than they spoke, and that quiet acted as both test and transformation. By withholding speech, the aspirant learned to value order over impulse and to respect the authority of the teacher. Once admitted fully, the initiate could receive more advanced instruction on proportion, music, and the moral use of knowledge. The path taught that truth has weight and that the right to speak must be earned. The social dynamics of the school illustrate why secrecy can spread influence. A Pythagorean who traveled carried with them a recognizable manner and a set of signs that opened doors with those who shared the training. These informal networks allowed ideas to move without formal institutions and gave members a sense of protection. Some communities resented this cohesion and accused the group of manipulation, while others respected the orderliness and piety of its citizens. In both cases, the school's reputation outlived its formal structures. Legends about Pythagorean feats and prohibitions multiplied over time, adding a layer of myth to a foundation of practice. The more the outside world guessed at the hidden teachings, the more the aura of the group grew. Later esoteric orders would find the same pattern helpful, since rumor can attract seekers who crave an entrance into something that seems both demanding and rewarding. A culture that links number, music, and virtue feels noble, and aspirants are willing to submit to its gates to gain that nobility. The legacy of the Pythagoreans in the story of secret societies sits in 3 lessons. First, initiation can be a discipline that reshapes personality. Second, a shared code can move ideas across borders without institutions. Third, myth builds around disciplined silence and can be used to recruit and to inspire. These lessons became a part of the grammar that later fraternities speak almost without realizing it. 200 BC, Hellenistic syncretism and cults of Isis and Serapis. The Hellenistic era spread blended mysteries across a web of cities and ports that connected the Mediterranean world. Merchants, soldiers, and administrators carried rites of Isis and Serapis from Egypt to Greek and Roman lands, adapting ceremonies to local tastes while preserving core initiatory patterns. The appeal lay in a portable spirituality that promised protection and personal connection to divine care. Initiates learned songs and gestures that traveled more easily than temple walls, which turned secrecy into a vessel for comfort in unfamiliar places. Syncretism changed the audience and the tone of hidden rites. A goddess who had once been tied to a river valley now spoke through hymns that sounded at home in theaters and forums. The private instruction still required trust and training, yet the surrounding culture accepted the presence of these cults as part of urban life. Even when authorities worried about foreign practices, they often tolerated them when they kept order and paid dues. That balance gave initiates space to form networks that crossed ethnic and civic boundaries. The mechanics of initiation in this era show a growing sophistication. Rites taught through stages that left a seeker with a sense of rising through levels of meaning, and that graded structure would become standard in many later orders. The narrative of death and rebirth, of purification and illumination, and of the new name given to the initiate offered a script that was repeatable and memorable. Those who passed through it felt twice born into a family that extended beyond kin. That feeling is a powerful engine for loyalty and charity. Secrecy served practical functions in this setting as well. To protect the details of a rite was to protect its dignity in a bustling city where spectacle could cheapen anything. Private instruction shielded the symbolic core from mockery and ensured that only the committed received the full experience. A quiet room could transform a cosmopolitan neighborhood into a sanctuary that belonged to the few, and by extension to the many who might one day be ready. In that modest way, secrecy acted as a guard for seriousness. The spread of these mysteries reminds us that circulation and adaptation can preserve rather than dilute a tradition. When groups move across languages and laws, the shared signs become a lifeline that keeps scattered members from feeling isolated. An initiate arriving in a new city could seek out a shrine and find companions who knew the same responses. Out of that simple exchange comes the durable social fabric that secret societies provide during times of migration and change. 150 AD, Rome's collegia and Mithraism in the empire. The Roman world fostered a broad array of collegia that combined worship, trade, and mutual aid behind membership rules. Some were simple associations that provided funerals and feasts, while others cultivated particular gods with private rites. Among the latter, Mithraism gained attention for its cave-like meeting spaces and graded ranks that led initiates through trials and banquets. The imagery spoke to soldiers and officials who valued courage, loyalty, and order, and the brotherhoods mapped easily onto the discipline of garrisons and offices. A Roman could therefore be a citizen in public and a Mithraic initiate in private without contradiction. Mithraic lodges organized knowledge through a clear ladder. Names like Raven and Soldier suggested a path from newcomer to trusted participant, and each grade introduced new symbols and responsibilities. The shape of the meetings built solidarity through shared meals and rehearsed stories of cosmic struggle. The secrecy here was not primarily about hiding from police. It was about marking the difference between the curious and the committed. That line allowed the lodge to invest heavily in those who crossed it. Urban collegia showed how secrecy and charity could reinforce one another. Members paid dues, visited the sick, and ensured burials for the poor among them, which created a practical stake in belonging. The promise that one's children would find guardians through the association turned secrecy into a kind of insurance. Since Roman life could be harsh for those without patrons, the lodge often acted as a second family that bridged gaps of origin and rank. Outsiders could recognize the fruits of this system, even if they never learned a single password. Authorities alternated between tolerance and suspicion depending on the climate. When emperors feared sedition, they restricted assemblies, but when stability returned, they often allowed the collegia to operate as engines of order. The groups themselves learned to present their work in ways that reassured magistrates and gained the favor of local elites. This dance between visibility and reserve taught later fraternities how to survive under watchful governments without abandoning their inner life. Pragmatism proved as vital as devotion. By late antiquity, Mithraism receded, yet its structural lessons remained. Graded initiation, a network of small sanctuaries, a brotherhood bound by meals and trials, and a discipline that supported daily duty all became part of the heritage of secret societies. The Roman case demonstrates that secrecy can serve as a school for citizenship as much as an escape from it. That paradox will echo through many later stories. 290 AD, esoteric currents in late antiquity, Gnostics and Manichaeans. Late antiquity birthed movements that treated knowledge as salvation and guarded it in circles that often faced hostility. Gnostic schools used myths of divine sparks and archons to describe a world in need of awakening, and they communicated teachings through texts and teachers who judged readiness. Manichaeans built a global mission with inner and outer ranks that distinguished rigorous elect from committed hearers, and they survived by secrecy when rulers condemned their doctrine. In both cases, the management of access was a matter of survival as well as fidelity to a demanding vision. Textual secrecy took on new intensity in this era. Copyists worked in private, and scrolls circulated hand-to-hand rather than through public libraries, which made possession itself a mark of membership. The interpretation of those writings required mentorship, so seekers joined households or small assemblies where elders provided guidance. This pattern of mentorship could turn a home into a micro-monastery, protected by ordinary walls and the caution of those who lived within them. A culture of watchfulness grew around the precious pages. Persecution sharpened the strategies of concealment. Communities developed code words, safe meeting times, and ways to pass resources without attracting notice. Members learned to present themselves as loyal subjects while reserving their ultimate trust for the inner circle. That double life was not hypocrisy in their eyes. It was a necessary adaptation in a world that punished dissent. Later, reformers and fraternities would copy these methods when they too found themselves under pressure. The ethical demands of these groups forged strong bonds. Elect members of Manichaean communities accepted strict rules that set them apart at table and in labor, while hearers supported them with food and shelter. Gnostic seekers often embraced ascetic practices that disciplined desire and focused attention on the inward journey. Such commitments strengthened resolve and made betrayal less likely, since defectors would lose not only beliefs, but the structure of their daily lives. In that sense, secrecy protected a way of being rather than a list of doctrines. Though many late antique esoteric movements waned, they left behind a template for survival under suspicion. The template includes the pairing of public caution with private intensity, the use of mentorship to guard interpretation, and the sense that knowledge heals the soul. Future societies that face pressure will return to this toolkit, not because they copy it directly, but because the logic of human community under stress presents them with similar choices. 1100 AD monastic rules lay confraternities and medieval craft guilds. Medieval Europe cultivated forms of association that used vows, grades, and guarded knowledge to organize life and work. Monastic orders codified rules that turned houses into disciplined families, whose members advanced through stages of promise and profession. Around them lay confraternities, gathered laypeople into devotional and charitable groups that met in chapels and halls, often with simple initiations and distinct insignia. In towns and cities, craft guilds guarded techniques and regulated entry into a trade through apprenticeships, tests, and oaths. None of these bodies aimed to be clandestine, yet each kept inner matters within the circle. The guilds demonstrate how practical secrecy can be. Mastery of a craft requires years of training, and the value of that mastery depends on scarcity and quality. By controlling who could call themselves a master, the guild protected both wages and standards. Rituals that accompanied the step from apprentice to journeyman to master added dignity to economic facts, and the pledge to keep trade secrets blended professional pride with moral duty. Outsiders often respected the results, because a seal of the guild promised reliability. Confraternities provided social insurance and spiritual companionship for those not called to monastic life. Members paid dues, processed on feast days, and cared for one another in times of illness and death. The use of badges, banners, and private meetings gave these groups a sense of identity that outlasted individual lifetimes. Secrecy in this context did not hide scandal. It preserved intimacy and protected the internal conversations that make charity possible. Communities that trust one another talk frankly about needs, and frank talk requires discretion. Monasteries perfected graded commitment as a path to stability. A novice tested the life before vows, and full profession transformed a person's name, schedule, and relationships. Even when cloisters welcomed visitors, they kept the chapter room and refectory governed by customs that signaled belonging. The rules taught that order is a shared achievement that cannot be explained to strangers in an afternoon. Later fraternities will imitate this step-by-step discipline because it turns fragile enthusiasm into durable fidelity. These medieval forms set patterns that survive in modern societies, both secret and open. A balance of public face and private order, a ladder of admission that dignifies growth, and a guarded body of practice or technique all make groups coherent. The lesson is that secrecy can be ethical and service-oriented when it protects a craft, sustains charity, or anchors prayer. Suspicion rises when the balance tilts away from service toward advantage, and that moral judgment will shape reputations for centuries. 1119 AD, the Knights Templar fame fall and the birth of a legend. The Knights Templar began as a small company of warriors who vowed to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land and soon grew into a trans-regional institution with houses, farms, ships, and a banking arm. Their rule blended monastic obedience with military duty, and their discipline made them both useful and admired. Symbols and signs helped Templars recognize one another across borders and languages, while centralized leadership coordinated resources for campaigns and fortifications. The blend of vow, brotherhood, and logistics gave the order a unique profile in medieval society. Financial skill increased their influence in ways that went beyond the battlefield. The order accepted deposits, transferred funds across long distances, and issued letters that made travel safer for merchants and nobles. Those services simplified administration for kings and popes and linked local houses to a broad network that could mobilize money as well as men. The reputation for honesty and efficiency brought gifts of land and exemptions that made the Templars both wealthy and resented. Wealth mixed with secrecy would later feed rumors that rarely matched reality. The fall of the order came swiftly after changes in the political map reduced their strategic value. When powerful creditors wanted relief and enemies needed a target, accusations offered a tool to seize property and break a rival. Trials that featured forced confessions painted lurid pictures of hidden rites that scholars continue to doubt, and the public spectacle made complexity hard to defend. Once papal support faltered, the order could not withstand coordinated pressure from a determined monarch. That sequence turned an admired brotherhood into a cautionary tale about power and envy. After suppression, legend filled the vacuum left by the facts. Writers claim that the Templars carried secret knowledge into exile, or that they re-emerged under new names with hidden agendas. The distance between what can be documented and what has been imagined grew wider with each generation, and storytellers found no shortage of listeners. The combination of lost wealth, broken vows, and the idea of a hidden treasure proved irresistible. Many later fraternities would be linked to the Templars in popular tales regardless of evidence. The enduring lesson of the Templar story is that fame and secrecy make a volatile mix when fortunes shift. An organization that relies on exemptions and favors must also cultivate goodwill, and when goodwill collapses, protection can vanish overnight. The memory of how quickly glory turned to ash taught later societies to be careful about public image and financial exposure. It also sharpened the public instinct to connect closed doors with hidden plots, a habit that will shape the reputation of many groups to come. 1200 AD Ismailis and the Nizari strongholds. The Nizari branch of the Ismailis built mountain fortresses and missionary networks that required discretion and discipline to survive in a hostile environment. Their call to allegiance combined intellectual argument with careful vetting, and their communities practiced a calibrated secrecy that protected leaders and doctrine. While polemical enemies painted them as masters of terror, the history of their administration shows a society concerned with survival, education, and the defense of its people. Hidden routes and coded messages were tools for continuity rather than masquerade for conquest. This distinction matters when assessing the ethics of secrecy. Strongholds such as Alamut formed schools as well as redoubts. Libraries collected texts, and teachers trained students in law and philosophy, suggesting that the inner life of these communities valued thought as much as steel. Members learned to live with caution without surrendering curiosity, and that habit produced a culture able to absorb external pressures. When sieges came, this preparation bought time and resilience, though not always victory. The link between learning and loyalty became a signature of the tradition. Recruitment operated through personal ties and careful conversations rather than through public rallies. Dawa agents used hospitality and debate to persuade potential allies, and they avoided drawing attention that would invite crackdowns. This method required patience and fine judgment about character, since a single careless contact could jeopardize many lives. Training in discretion became an ethical practice rather than a mere tactic, and that practice is recognizable in later societies that combine intellectual ambition with survival strategies. The outside world responded with a mixture of fear and respect. Opponents spun tales that magnified the menace of hidden blades, while travelers reported communities that managed terraced fields and libraries with care. Both images contain slivers of truth filtered through the anxieties of a violent age. The gap between polemic and daily life in these enclaves shows how secrecy can be read as menace by those who feel threatened and as prudent discipline by those who live within the walls. Historical judgment requires slow reading rather than quick rumor. In the long view, the Nizari experience adds a chapter about minorities who protect identity through layered access to leaders, texts, and places. That layering allows a small people to endure storms that would otherwise scatter them. The model is not a blueprint for all times, but it teaches that secrecy can be a tool of cultural persistence rather than a cloak for domination. That lesson will reappear when other persecuted groups build resilient networks under pressure. 1300 AD Sufi brotherhoods, chains of transmission and inner teaching. Across the Islamic world, Sufi brotherhoods organized seekers into paths that balanced public devotion with inner instruction. A chain of transmission linked living teachers to earlier masters, and initiates received litanies and disciplines that shaped perception and character. Lodges welcomed the poor, fed travelers, and taught remembrance through music and quiet practice. Yet the deeper moments of instruction unfolded in small rooms between guide and student. The secrecy here protected intimacy and kept the sacred from becoming spectacle. Those who entered understood that discretion preserved the sweetness of the path. Initiation in Sufi circles often took the form of a pledge of allegiance to a teacher, accompanied by a token or cloak that marked inclusion. The new disciple learned a rhythm of remembrance and a code of manners that distinguished the path from ordinary life. With time, the student might receive permission to teach others, extending the chain without advertising. This gentle expansion built communities that could endure political changes and traveling rulers. The lodge became a lighthouse for the faithful and a school for patience. The public face of these brotherhoods made them beloved, while the inner face invited misunderstanding. Neighbors heard songs that stirred hearts and saw kitchens that fed the hungry, and they gave thanks for the mercy that flowed from the lodge. Critics worried that private teachings could harbor error, and they pressed for clarity that the circles did not always provide. This tension between service and suspicion is a common feature of groups with inner rooms. Good works lower the temperature, but they do not erase the anxieties of those who fear what they cannot see. Sufi lineages transmitted not only words but styles of attention. Disciples learned how to listen, breathe, and respond to daily duties with mindful presence, and that training produced visible changes in behavior. A person who has been taught to govern their tongue and to forgive quickly is easy to recognize in a marketplace. The quiet that is cultivated in a cell echoes in an alley, and those echoes become the best advertisement for the path. In that way, secrecy becomes a perfume rather than a wall. What Sufi brotherhoods add to the story of secret societies is an emphasis on inner transformation as the real treasure. The guarded elements matter, but they matter as a means to turn habits into virtues. That focus provides a counterpoint to societies that prize strategy and influence, reminding readers that some closed circles guard silence primarily to help seekers hear the truth more clearly. The difference is not always visible from the street, which is why careful attention to motive matters in this history. 1400 AD late medieval and early modern occult revivals. As Europe moved toward the early modern period, scholars and artisans revived ancient sciences with new energy, and they often did so in private circles that guarded experiments and manuscripts. Astrology, alchemy, and natural magic promised insights into the hidden properties of matter and the timing of earthly events. Practitioners formed salons and corresponded in coded phrases to avoid ridicule or interference while testing new techniques. A blend of curiosity and caution produced an atmosphere where secrecy and discovery walked together. The combination shaped how later societies would imagine esoteric learning. Printing changed the flow of knowledge by spreading texts that hinted at deeper layers available only to prepared minds. Treatises described allegorical vessels and veiled processes that invited readers to seek a mentor or join a circle. Laboratories developed into sacred spaces where apprentices learned by hand and eye rather than by public lecture. The decision to reveal a little and conceal a lot turned books into invitations rather than open instruction. Those who accepted the invitation stepped into communities defined by shared puzzles. The ethics of concealment in these circles mixed prudence with pedagogy. A recipe for a powerful tincture or a reading for a royal horoscope could create enemies as easily as friends. By keeping sensitive procedures within trusted hands, experimenters protected themselves and preserved time to refine methods. They also believed that difficult knowledge should be earned through discipline, since power without character could harm both seeker and neighbor. That conviction echoes in many initiatory orders that treat secrecy as a shield for virtue. Patronage made secrecy more complex. Wealthy supporters wanted results without scandal, and they expected their protégés to manage reputations with care. Letters were routed through intermediaries, and meetings were arranged at odd hours to keep images unsullied. The dance of favor and fear trained a generation in the practical arts of discretion. Those arts would later help fraternal orders navigate courts and parliaments with a calm that looked mysterious to those on the outside. What emerges from this period is a sense that hidden work can be a path to useful knowledge rather than a flight from reason. The private laboratory and the guarded notebook often served the common good by advancing techniques that later became public. The boundary between secret study and open science remained porous, and many reputations depended on crossing it wisely. From that tension grew a modern attitude toward esoteric groups as potential partners or rivals in the quest to understand nature. 1700 AD Rosicrucian manifestos and the idea of a hidden brotherhood. In the early 17th century, pamphlets appeared in German lands proclaiming the existence of a fraternity dedicated to universal reform and secret wisdom. The manifestos told a story about a founder and a house filled with symbolic treasures, inviting readers to seek membership and to prepare themselves for a new age of learning and piety. Scholars still debate whether an organized body stood behind the texts, or whether the manifestos served as a provocation to imagine better ways of living and working. Either way, the idea of a hidden brotherhood captured imaginations across Europe. The response to these writings created communities even if no single order existed at the start. Readers exchanged letters, formed circles, and wrote commentaries that treated the manifestos as a map to a life of disciplined study and charity. Bookshops and salons turned into informal lodges where initiates in spirit, if not in fact, discussed how to unite the best of religion, philosophy, and natural inquiry. In this way, a fiction spurred realities that lasted for generations, the lines between myth and movement blurred by consent. The rhetoric of the manifestos shaped later societies in deep ways. They proposed that true wisdom is ancient yet ever new, that it requires humility and service, and that it can be organized through friendly bonds rather than through compulsion. Symbols and allegories did the work of initiation for those who read with attention. Those who failed to see the signs excluded themselves without any need for guards at a door. This inclusive exclusivity became a hallmark of many esoteric currents. Critics accused the movement of deceit, while defenders argued that veils protect the immature from misusing strong medicine. Public debate about the meaning and morality of secrecy grew more sophisticated as philosophers weighed liberty against prudence. Governments watched closely, but often found little to punish because the gatherings preached reform through virtue rather than rebellion through force. The conversation about how secret a society may be in a free world gained sharper contours. That conversation will resurface whenever fraternities spread. Out of the Rosicrucian moment came a renewed confidence that hidden brotherhoods could serve as engines of improvement. Even those who doubted the literal truth of the manifestos admired the goal of forming networks of kind discipline and learned charity. Later orders would borrow the imagery and the tone while building more durable institutions. The seed planted by those pamphlets grew into a forest of lodges, reading rooms, and friendly societies that shaped the 18th century. 1717 AD, from operative to speculative, the rise of Freemasonry. When guild structures loosened in the early modern world, a new kind of lodge emerged that used the symbols of the Mason's craft to teach moral and social lessons. Freemasonry presented itself as a brotherhood that welcomed men of goodwill, regardless of rank or sect, bound them by oath, and advanced them through degrees that used tools as metaphors. The lodge room offered a space where merchants, nobles, and artisans could meet as equals and practice disciplined conversation. That promise of harmony within diversity proved magnetic in a century of religious and political tension. Initiation into a Masonic lodge combined simple charges with carefully staged instruction. The candidate learned signs and phrases that allowed recognition during travel and received lectures that turned square and compass into guides for conscience. A second and third degree deepened the moral narrative, creating a sense of progress that mirrored the upward steps of a craft. Members took pride in punctual meetings, orderly votes, and charitable projects that translated ideals into daily habits. The result was a school for civility disguised as a club. The spread of the fraternity across Europe and the Atlantic suggested that a common ritual language could bridge regional divides. A traveler with a certificate could visit a lodge in a different city and find hosts ready to assist with introductions and advice. That network supported careers and fostered a literate culture of minutes, letters, and printed constitutions. Secrecy here functioned as a gate that kept the meeting focused and as a spice that made the experience memorable. It did not require teaching a body of hidden doctrine beyond the public ethics of brotherly love and relief. Public reactions ranged from admiration to alarm. Admirers saw a training ground for good citizens who practiced moderation and helped the poor, while critics feared that any closed circle might pursue agendas that harmed church or crown. The fraternity replied that secrecy protected privacy, kept politics and sectarian quarrels outside the door, and improved men who would otherwise remain strangers. Over time, this defense convinced many neighbors, although suspicion never vanished. The balance between openness about aims and reserve about rites became an art. Freemasonry's rise matters in this history because it popularized a model that many other groups would imitate: a clear ladder of degrees, an ideal of universal fraternity, and a rhythm of charity and fellowship created a durable pattern for voluntary association. The lodge turned secrecy from a tool of survival into a method for forming character in relative peace. That method will be tested in new ways as revolution and reaction shake the modern world. 1750 AD, Freemasonry and politics, rumors, networks, and panics. As Masonic lodges multiplied, rumors about their political influence grew in both directions. Some observers credited lodges with advancing reform by spreading practices of orderly debate and merit-based recognition, while others accused them of plotting to subvert established powers. The truth varied by place and season, but the image of men meeting across ranks troubled authorities who feared the unpredictable. A society that prided itself on avoiding partisan quarrels could still produce friendships that mattered in public life. That fact made privacy controversial. Revolutions and reforms created moments when Masonic rhetoric of liberty and tolerance sounded attractive, and ambitious men carried lodge habits into assemblies and clubs. Enemies noticed the overlap and concluded that the lodge caused the politics rather than preparing minds for civic work more generally. In other times and regions, the same fraternity produced loyalists who defended monarchies with equal vigor. This variability frustrates simple claims about a single political program. Networks shape opportunity without dictating conscience. Anti-Masonic panics reveal how quickly secrecy can change from charming to sinister. When a sensational case put a missing man at the center of public fear in the early United States, newspapers and pulpits turned private rituals into a threat to the Republic. Political parties formed around opposition to the lodge, and legislatures flirted with restrictions. The fraternity survived by emphasizing charity, transparency about aims, and the ordinariness of most meetings. That strategy worked slowly, but it worked well enough to restore a measure of trust. States and churches issued prohibitions that varied in severity, which forced lodges to learn the arts of compliance and discretion. Some closed, some continued quietly, and some negotiated compromises that limited activities. The experience taught members that a good reputation is as valuable as a good ritual, and that public service can repair suspicion faster than argument. The lesson has broad relevance for all societies that depend on the consent of neighbors to operate in peace. Trust is a daily labor, not a one-time gift. By the end of the 18th century, Masonic lodges had become a normal feature of civil society in many regions while remaining controversial in others. The fraternity's political legacy is best read as a set of habits rather than as a hidden program. Habits of orderly meeting, brotherly aid, respectful speech, and regular charity seeped into the civic fabric. The suspicion that clung to secrecy never vanished, but the good that communities saw in action often outlasted the fear that paper rumors tried to spread. 1776 AD, the Bavarian Illuminati: origins, aims, and suppression. In the final quarter of the 18th century, a professor of law founded a society dedicated to moral improvement and political reform through a system of cells and graded instruction. The Bavarian Illuminati recruited ambitious young men, many of them already active in lodges, and promised a path toward reasoned virtue that would lift society from superstition and tyranny. Members adopted aliases, studied carefully chosen texts, and worked to influence circles of opinion rather than to seize power by force. The secrecy here was strategic and pedagogical, designed to protect a network and to train the will. The structure of the Illuminati borrowed from older models while adding innovations. Small groups knew only a few contacts, which limited damage if an informer appeared, and supervisors gathered reports to steer the whole without meeting everyone at once. Degrees offered a sense of progress and gave leaders tools to test loyalty. The curriculum combined moral essays with practical advice about conversation and persuasion, which made the society as much a school of character as a club. Many who joined enjoyed the camaraderie even more than the lectures. Authorities reacted with alarm once the scale of the organization became clearer through seized papers and confessions. Edicts banned secret societies in general and the Illuminati in particular, and the network unraveled under pressure. Pamphleteers then took fragments of truth and expanded them into sweeping claims that the society had engineered revolutions and controlled states. The gap between what the papers show and what rumors claim remains wide, and careful historians try to keep those lines untangled. Sensationalism proved more durable than evidence. The legend of the Illuminati grew precisely because the reality ended quickly. A short-lived experiment in moral reform turned into a symbol of world-directing conspiracy in the popular imagination. Novelists and polemicists found the name too useful to abandon, and the public learned to associate any elite gathering with that label. This linguistic shortcut obscures differences between charities, clubs, and actual conspiracies. Yet the myth persists because it answers psychological needs for simple explanations. What the episode teaches is that secrecy plus ambition will always invite projection. Groups that seek to shape culture should expect scrutiny and should plan for fair audits of their claims. Transparency about aims and humility about methods help, though they do not silence every critic. In this case, the distance between intention and legend is a warning about the power of names to outrun facts. Readers who love history can enjoy the drama while refusing to be misled by its shadows. 1799 AD Catholic, Protestant, and state reactions. Reactions to secret societies hardened as church leaders and officials weighed the risks of private oaths and closed rituals during a turbulent age. Some Catholic authorities issued condemnations that warned the faithful against fraternities that required vows outside the sacramental life, and police ministries in several kingdoms kept files on lodges and circles to watch for sedition. Protestant voices split, with some pastors arguing that secrecy undercut the clarity of congregational life, while others joined friendly societies as tools for moral improvement and mutual help. The debate did not move in a single line. It rose and fell with local fears and the character of specific groups. Public trust became the decisive currency of survival. Within the Catholic world, the strongest concerns focused on authority and discipline, since oaths to a lodge could appear to compete with obedience to church and crown. Bishops asked whether private ceremonies taught ideas that confused simple believers or encouraged indifference to doctrine, and rulers asked whether closed meetings provided cover for political discussions that should remain in daylight. Those questions produced bans and penalties in some regions, while in others a quieter accommodation took shape around lodges that emphasized charity and civility. Where friendships between clergy and members were strong, suspicion softened, and where relations were brittle, decrees bit hard. Outcomes depended on patience as much as policy. Protestant lands produced a more varied landscape because discipline rested more directly on congregations and civic authorities rather than on a single hierarchy. Some pastors served as chaplains to lodges and praised the way temperance talks and relief funds supported working families, while others preached that any oath taken outside the church invited confusion. Town councils worried more about riots than about ritual, so fraternities that kept politics outside their doors often won permission to meet. The key was to show that secrecy protected privacy rather than power. Groups that failed that test invited storms that lasted for years. States learned to treat secret societies as a management problem rather than a pure moral question. Police ministries experimented with registration, with informers, and with selective prosecutions to keep a handle on gatherings that might tilt toward agitation. The aim was not always to crush every meeting, because officials saw how friendly societies reduced poverty and soothed conflict, but to ensure that no circle could become a rival government. This administrative mindset turned secrecy from a theological scandal into a bureaucratic category. That shift changed the tone of the whole conversation. Public scandals could reset the clock overnight. A sensational disappearance or a courtroom drama that featured lodge signs could turn neighbors into critics who demanded action, even if the facts were murky. Newspapers amplified fears and sold copies by hinting that closed doors hid crimes that ordinary policing could not reach. Fraternities responded by publishing constitutions, holding charity parades, and inviting respected citizens to open portions of ceremonies to prove their harmlessness. The push and pull between rumor and reassurance became a defining rhythm of the age. Intellectuals added another layer by arguing about the role of voluntary associations in free societies. Some philosophers defended the right to meet in private as part of civil liberty, provided that groups obeyed the laws and contributed to the common good, while others warned that private oaths corroded public trust. These arguments shaped court decisions and influenced lawmakers who had to decide whether to regulate, to tolerate, or to forbid. The most durable settlements were not perfect, they were practical, and they relied on steady goodwill from both sides. Where that goodwill held, secrecy and citizenship learned to live together. The lasting lesson from these reactions is not a single verdict, but a method, because churches and states judged groups by behavior, by public benefit, and by their willingness to accept oversight. Societies that embraced charity and avoided faction often earned space to breathe, while those that flirted with intrigue drew fire they could not withstand. The result is a map of cautionary tales and workable compromises that still guides how modern communities evaluate private orders. Memory of these struggles continues to shape reputations. 1835 AD, the 19th century fraternal boom. Industrial cities filled with strangers created a hunger for belonging, and friendly societies answered with halls, rituals, and insurance funds that turned neighbors into brothers. Lodges multiplied across Britain, North America, and parts of Europe, offering sick pay, funeral benefits, and a calendar of meetings that broke the loneliness of factory life. Ceremonies were elaborate enough to feel meaningful, yet simple enough to teach quickly, and degrees gave members a sense of progress that balanced the grind of daily work. The promise was not salvation from the world, it was steadiness within it. Millions found the offer compelling. Mutual aid sat at the center of this boom, since lodges pooled small dues into large reserves that could rescue a family when illness struck or a breadwinner died. Treasurers kept careful books, visiting committees checked on the sick, and stewards organized meals that welcomed newcomers. Rituals wrapped this practical work in drama that dignified ordinary care with a sense of mission. Passwords and signs allowed travelers to claim help from faraway halls, which gave the network a reach that surprised outsiders. Charity moved along these lines with quiet efficiency. Theatrical elements made the meetings memorable without turning them into spectacles. Robes, emblems, and staged lessons taught virtues like fidelity, truth, and relief, while officers practiced speaking and procedure that trained them for roles in town life. Halls served as spaces for lectures, concerts, and blood drives long before the term existed, and widows and orphans learned the faces of men who would show up when needed. This blend of pageant and service created a civic school that complemented churches and schools. A man could grow into leadership by carrying a rod and learning a ritual. Growth invited imitation, and soon dozens of fraternities competed for members with different emphases and costs. Some targeted specific trades, some built identities around historical heroes, and some leaned into moral reform movements such as temperance. Despite differences, they shared core features of oath, initiation, and mutual care, and they often borrowed ceremonies from one another with small changes. Critics called this copying a sign of hollowness, while members saw it as proof that good ideas travel. The variety kept halls busy and neighborhoods connected. Women organized their own circles that mirrored and sometimes corrected the men. Sisterhoods formed auxiliaries or independent orders that provided relief funds, education, and a social world guided by dignity and discipline. Children learned to recite charges about kindness and duty in junior lodges that prepared them for adult service. These parallel institutions expanded the reach of mutual aid and made the fraternal world a family affair. Whole streets could point to the hall as the place where help began. Racial and class lines cut across this boom in ways that hurt and healed. Segregated societies arose where prejudice blocked entry, and those societies built strong cultures that defended dignity and independence in the face of exclusion. Elite clubs refined rituals to emphasize honor and philanthropy, while working-class lodges stressed wages and solidarity. The common language of initiation allowed conversations that might not have been possible otherwise. Secrecy here acted as a leveler by teaching that character matters more than birth. The 19th century fraternal surge matters for the history of secret societies because it normalized secrecy as a tool of care rather than an omen of conspiracy. Lodge rooms became engines of literacy, thrift, and neighborhood peace, and the public learned to associate closed doors with soup kitchens and funerals rather than with plots. Myths did not disappear, but they had to compete with visible service that earned loyalty. That change in reputation set the stage for new experiments in ritual and meaning at the century's end. 1848 AD revolutionary brotherhoods and nation-making. Across Europe and parts of the Mediterranean, clandestine cells rallied dreamers who believed that a nation could be born through oath and courage when parliaments failed. Small rooms hosted men who memorized signs, learned passwords, and accepted strict discipline so that arrests could not break the chain of command. These brotherhoods recruited students, artisans, and soldiers who longed for independence or constitutional government and who believed that secrecy offered the only safe road to coordination. The mood mixed idealism with danger. Songs learned in whispers became banners in the street when the moment arrived. Italy's secret networks supplied a vivid example of how oath-bound circles could prepare minds for a wider movement. Cells met in homes and workshops, read contraband pamphlets, and practiced methods for silent communication that would carry messages across provinces. Plots were discovered, leaders were imprisoned, and efforts failed often. Yet the steady hum of organization kept hope alive between open uprisings. The idea that a disciplined few could spark the courage of the many justified patience. Each failed attempt taught better craft for the next season. Similar logics took root in other lands where educated patriots faced censorship and exile. Societies of exiles abroad served as hubs where emissaries traded news and sought funds, while sympathizers at home sheltered couriers and hid presses. A language of brotherhood bridged class divides by promising honor to anyone who risked safety for the cause. Critics called these networks the playthings of romantics, yet the persistence of the cells meant that when political climates shifted, leaders and plans already existed. Secrecy preserved tinder until a wind rose. Techniques of concealment grew more refined as police grew more skillful. Code names replaced signatures, meeting places rotated, and passwords changed with the moon to stay ahead of informers. The best organizers learned to separate social friendship from operational need so that betrayal could not unravel an entire district. Training borrowed from the old art of lodges, but stripped away the convivial elements that might draw attention. A stern ethic of duty replaced pageant. Many recruits aged fast under that pressure. The moral landscape of revolutions complicated the legacy of these brotherhoods. Some cells used violence in ways that frightened ordinary citizens and gave rulers excuses to tighten control, while others disciplined members to aim at symbols of oppression rather than at random crowds. The choice between speed and persuasion divided leaders who never had time to resolve their debates. In the wake of success or failure, memories of secret trials and hurried sentences colored how the public remembered the underground. Those who sacrificed freedom lived with both honor and blame. Nation-making through secrecy carried a high cost in lives and friendships, yet it proved that the skills of closed circles could serve more than private advancement. When a flag finally flew over a new parliament, veterans of the cells often tried to turn their discipline into public service as editors, administrators, or teachers. Some succeeded, some could not drop old habits, and some found that secrecy had become a second skin. The paradox of liberation born in hidden rooms remained. Future movements would study both the courage and the scars. 1890 AD, Esoteric Orders of the Fin de Siècle, a new kind of lodge gathered in drawing rooms lit by gaslight, where poetry, ritual, and study promised access to hidden currents of wisdom. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn offered graded initiations that framed a path from curiosity to adeptship, using dramatic ceremonies to turn moral lessons into lived experience. Members memorized signs, traced figures in the air, and kept notebooks that recorded dreams beside diagrams. Women held offices alongside men in several temples, a striking contrast to many older fraternities. A movement that prized symbolism also taught discipline that could be tested in plain life. Theosophy braided Eastern and Western strands by arguing that a perennial teaching lay beneath the religions of the world. Its leaders printed journals, organized public lectures, and kept inner schools where selected students practiced meditation and study under guidance. This blend of open outreach and private instruction raised a question that has not faded. How much can a seeker be told at once without losing the thread? The answer was to offer layers, with public words to invite and private words to steady. Many found this pacing humane. Ordo Templi Orientis took up ideas about initiation and adapted them to an era that loved experimentation. Lodges used structured grades and dramatic rites to present a map of personal transformation, and reading lists directed students to texts that stretched attention. The emphasis was not on hoarding formulas, but on changing the practitioner through experience. In this way, secrecy acted like a frame around a painting, keeping the focus on what happens on the inside rather than on who looks through the window. A rite without a frame loses force. Print culture changed the tempo of the secret. Pamphlets, magazines, and cheap books carried outlines of teachings far beyond the walls of any temple, while private letters debated methods and corrected errors among friends. The result was a conversation that flowed between salons and sanctums, with the same names appearing on public title pages and private membership rolls. This cross-traffic made the scene lively and contentious at once. Arguments sharpened practices that might have stayed vague. Schisms and scandals tested loyalty in these circles and forced them to define what they valued most. Was a temple a place for refined art and polite study, or was it a forge for courage that could withstand ridicule and hardship? Members answered with their feet, founding new bodies or reforming old ones when trust broke. The pattern of rupture and renewal became familiar in the esoteric world. Out of each break came a clearer sense of purpose and a leaner definition of brotherhood. The legacy of the fin de siècle orders rests in their conviction that ritual is a language capable of teaching truths that prose alone cannot reach. Their lodges trained attention, imagination, and will, and their reading rooms opened doors to global traditions without demanding that students abandon their own roots. Critics still ask whether the results match the promises, and admirers still testify that simple acts done with reverence can make a life. The debate itself shows that something alive was set in motion. 1895 AD, Asian secret societies. In Chinese-speaking worlds, brotherhoods trace their origin to vows of justice that legends placed in ancient gardens, and in the modern era, these tales gave courage to migrants far from home. Hongmen and triad lineages blended ritual, mutual aid, and codes that governed behavior in hall and street, while oaths sealed loyalty with language about honor and family. Members carried passwords and hand signs that could unlock help in an unfamiliar port or market. These signals mattered when the law was distant and strangers were many. Belonging could be the difference between isolation and a path. Across the oceans, tongs formed in North American cities as protective associations for Chinese merchants and workers who faced hostility and legal barriers. Publicly, they ran halls, festivals, and relief funds, while privately, they arbitrated disputes and sometimes drifted into shadowy trades that brought money and trouble. Community leaders argued over lines that should not be crossed, and newspapers painted every closed door with a single color. The truth refused to be simple. Many halls fed the poor and hired teachers, while a few gambled with the peace of their neighbors. In Japan, the story of organized groups that guarded turf and traded favors raises difficult questions about where tradition ends and crime begins. Early forms of protection associations emerged in markets and ports, mixing mutual obligation with rough enforcement that filled gaps left by weak policing. Over time, some networks wrapped themselves in codes of honor and charity, while others drifted toward predation. Historians caution that myth and reality mingle in these accounts, because both admirers and enemies tell versions that suit their needs. The gray spaces resist quick judgment. Secrecy in Asian societies often served as a method of social governance rather than a taste for mystery. Initiation created a trusted circle that could collect dues, settle quarrels, and mount a defense when prejudice threatened jobs or safety. At the same time, codes could be abused by leaders who confused loyalty with obedience and service with tribute. Communities learned to watch carefully which way a hall leaned. A password is a blessing when it opens a kitchen, and a curse when it opens a door to fear. Colonial pressures and modern revolutions forced many brotherhoods to choose between politics and survival. Some turned toward nationalism and resistance, using their networks to move messages and people when official routes were blocked. Others focused on trade, funerals, and immigration assistance, keeping distance from storms they could not control. The outcomes varied by province and port. What remains constant is the human need that built the halls in the first place. People wanted safety, respect, and a place to stand together. The lesson these societies offer to the wider history of secrecy is that ritual kinship can be a lifeline in a world that is not friendly. Oaths that protect the weak merit praise, and codes that excuse harm deserve condemnation, yet both may wear the same colors. Careful reading of local records and memories is the only honest way to tell them apart. Grand theories fade beside the sound of a shopkeeper knocking on a known door and finding help. 1910 AD African and Atlantic societies. Across West Africa, initiation societies shaped law, education, and the passage from youth to responsibility. Poro councils instructed men in duties to land and lineage, taught the art of listening in assembly, and kept sacred regalia that marked authority. Sandi lodges guided girls into womanhood with instruction in health, skill, and the ethics of speech, and they guarded songs and stories that bound generations. Outsiders often saw only masks and processions, while insiders knew that governance and guidance stood behind the pageantry. A village without these circles felt unmoored. Yoruba lands offer a vivid case where Ogboni elders served as custodians of justice and balance, meeting to counsel rulers and to mediate disputes with an eye toward harmony. Their signs and honorifics created a language of respect that limited the reach of anger and greed. The secrecy here guarded the dignity of deliberation, not a stash of tricks. When trouble came, the weight of the lodge could slow rash acts and force negotiation. A hidden council can sometimes hold a town together better than a visible decree. The Atlantic world carried these habits across the water through enslaved people who rebuilt fragments of their social tools under terrible pressure. Maroon communities in the Americas developed councils and signals that kept watch, warning of danger, and teaching young fighters how to move and when to wait. Rituals marked entry into trusted roles and created ties that masters could not break. Songs that seemed to be work chants sometimes carried lines of instruction. Secrecy kept life alive where law meant cruelty. In coastal cities of the 19th century, Afro-Atlantic mutual aid societies organized funerals, pooled money for sickness, and kept traditions alive through festivals that blended old and new. Leaders wore sashes, carried staffs, and presided over meetings that used prayers and votes to steer funds, with records carefully kept in ledgers. Members initiated sons and nephews into a pride that could withstand scorn. The hall was a school for courage and thrift. Doors closed so dignity could breathe. Missionaries and colonial officials often misread what they saw, describing every mask as superstition and every council as menace. Over time, some learned that these bodies enforced rules that protected women from certain harms, guarded forests from reckless cutting, and punished theft with procedures that families accepted. A code shared in whispers can support justice when courts are far or corrupt. The right to choose who may listen is not the enemy of truth. In these settings, it is the shield that truth needs. The African and Atlantic traditions remind readers that secrecy can embody a philosophy of patience and care. It can teach boys not to rush to anger and girls to claim their voices without fear, and it can hold elders to account through shared memory and ritual checks. The masks are not the heart of the matter. The heart is the steady hand that keeps a community from falling apart when loud men demand haste. 1930 AD 20th century elites, clubs, and campus orders. In the modern century, a different breed of private circle rose to prominence, one that traded initiatory drama for quiet leverage. University-based societies recruited from small pools and taught members to rely on each other in careers that would stretch from boardrooms to ministries. The ceremonies were simple compared to older lodges, yet the selection itself carried power because it sorted the few from the many. Alumni networks acted like hidden scaffolding behind visible institutions. A closed dinner could matter more than a public debate. Clubs and retreats for the well-connected provided off-stage settings for conversation across industries and parties. The point, members said, was to allow frank talk without fear of headlines, so that compromise could be explored before the theater of formal negotiation. Critics asked whether such privacy shaded into unaccountable influence that bent policy toward the narrow. Defenders replied that any mature society needs rooms where rivals can speak plainly and revise positions without humiliation. The argument has never fully settled because both sides speak to real concerns. Mid-century conferences that gathered statesmen, editors, economists, and security thinkers added a layer of regularity to elite conversation. Unofficial rules kept quotations unattributed, encouraging candor while still allowing ideas to travel into print and policy through indirect routes. Observers outside the room saw a pattern that felt like orchestration and concluded that a hidden director must be at work. Participants inside the room saw an untidy exchange of views that sometimes produced consensus and sometimes produced nothing. The mystery looks larger from the street than from the table. Campus orders grew into rites of passage for a slice of future leaders, and their selection criteria became the subject of fascination and satire. Some prized athletic achievement, some academic rank, some family name, and some a mix of traits that promised influence. Rituals often leaned into play rather than awe, signaling that what mattered most was the roster of peers. Graduates found that a shared pin or phrase could open a door in a city far from the college green. Influence moved along these fine threads because people trust those they met as students. Media attention turned these circles into symbols of privilege, and protests demanded transparency where secrecy looked like unfair advantage. The groups that survived learned to explain themselves in terms of tradition and philanthropy, pointing to scholarships, libraries, and civic projects funded through alumni gifts. Privacy, they argued, does not automatically mean exclusion from the common good. The claim convinced some and angered others. The lesson for historians is to track outcomes rather than to rest with impressions. The modern elite society differs from the initiatory order because it uses secrecy as a privacy screen rather than as a ladder of transformation. The change matters, since it shifts the moral question from what a rite does to a person toward what a network does to a city. Evaluating such bodies requires patience, data, and a willingness to accept mixed verdicts. A room can shelter wisdom or entrench advantage. The difference shows in the lives of those who stand outside the door. 2020 AD secrecy in the digital age. The internet turned the logic of secrecy inside out by making information abundant and attention scarce. Online communities learned that the real treasure was not a hidden book, but a trusted circle that could filter signal from noise. Encrypted chats, invite-only servers, and subscription rooms replaced many of the gates that once required lodges and leases. Members adopted handles, changed rooms when leaks occurred, and used layered access to protect conversations that mattered to their projects or beliefs. A new architecture of discretion grew without mortar. Cultures of initiation adapted to screens with puzzles, stage drops, and lore that rewarded patience. Alternate reality games trained thousands to chase clues across sites and videos, building skills that bled into activism, marketing, and art. Some circles used these tools to teach history and science in playful ways, while others used them to push falsehoods that thrived on the thrill of belonging. The same mechanics that build fellowship can power a spiral of error. Design choices matter because they shape what types of behavior feel natural. Transparency movements changed expectations by publishing leaks and demanding open records, and their successes forced private groups to rethink what must be hidden and what can be shared. Many organizations began to publish charters, codes of conduct, and summaries of activity while keeping personal details off the public web. The aim was to earn trust without surrendering the safety that privacy provides. Audiences learned to expect receipts for claims of charity and impact. The dance between proof and prudence accelerated. Technology also multiplied risks that older societies never faced. A single screenshot could turn a foolish joke into a reputation crisis, and a single breach could expose an entire membership to harassment or worse. Responsible moderators learned to set clear rules, to train members in digital hygiene, and to respond quickly when bad actors appeared. Secrecy that ignores safety is not a virtue in this era. The wise circles treat privacy as a practice rather than as a slogan. New forms of credentialing emerged as communities experimented with tokens, badges, and proofs of contribution that could be verified without revealing legal names. The hope was to combine the convenience of global networks with the trust that once came from face-to-face recognition. Some experiments succeeded and created resilient communities of practice, while others collapsed under the weight of speculation or vanity. The painful lessons taught future organizers to favor service over spectacle. Durable networks reward those who do the work. The digital age teaches that secrecy is not disappearing. It is changing its tools and its tone. Private rooms will exist as long as people need safety, focus, and friendship, yet those rooms now sit inside a house with thin walls and many ears. The societies that flourish will be those that build clear ethics, practice accountability, and use discretion to protect purpose rather than to evade responsibility. In a loud world, a well-kept silence is still a craft worth learning. The enduring grammar of secrecy, paths that begin in temples and end in encrypted rooms, share a simple habit that outlives empires. People choose one another, agree to a code, and mark that agreement with a rite that turns strangers into a circle. What looks like a trick of symbols from the street feels like a promise at the altar or the lectern, and that promise binds harder than ink. The story you have heard is not about puppeteers behind the curtain. It is about the ordinary force of chosen loyalty. Legends grow because unlocked doors are dull and locked doors are interesting. The mind fills gaps with plots, and plots make better tales than ledgers or soup kitchens. Yet the record shows that most fraternities and orders spend more time balancing books, visiting the sick, guiding youth, and teaching patience than they do engineering coups. A myth may travel faster than a minute book, but the minute book is where the work lives. Learning to tell glamour from discipline is the first skill of a wise reader. A second lesson follows from watching gains and failures over centuries. Secrecy is not one thing, it is many tools in a small box. The same vow can shelter a persecuted minority or excuse petty tyranny inside a hall. The same password can open a pantry or a back room for harm. Ethics decide which path a circle takes, and accountability steers the journey. Good secrecy protects purpose and people. Bad secrecy hides rot until neighbors pay the bill. Influence rarely arrives as a master plan that moves nations like chessmen. Influence arrives as habits that shape how people listen, vote, hire, lend, and forgive. A lodge that trains officers to speak in turn and to honor the gavel sends citizens back into town who can run meetings without rage. A study circle that teaches members to separate rumor from proof sends parents and clerks back into life with steadier hands. This modest, multiplying power is the real legacy of closed rooms done well. Names that loom large in rumor stand smaller when placed beside their records. The Knights Templar show how wealth and privilege can sour goodwill in a heartbeat. Freemasonry shows how a common ritual language can bridge quarrels when tempers burn. The Bavarian Illuminati show how a short experiment can cast a shadow far longer than its span of days. Each case reminds us to weigh evidence before awe. Stories without sources give comfort to suspicion, not clarity to judgment. Modern networks teach a final practical point. Privacy can serve candor, candor can serve compromise, and compromise can serve peace. But each step requires trust that must be earned again and again. Publishing charters, auditing funds, and keeping promises in public make the private room tolerable to those who will never see it. The price of discretion in an age of instant disclosure is steady proof that discretion protects more than pride. Where proof is absent, patience runs thin. What survives when symbols fade are the human skills that secrecy once taught: courage to speak the truth in a small council, fidelity to show up for a brother or sister when illness strikes, curiosity that keeps a seeker reading instead of repeating slogans, craft that turns chaos into order on a hard night. These are the quiet gifts of circles that keep faith with their better angels. They do not glitter, but they endure. If the closed door still draws your eye, ask a better question than who sits inside. Ask what kind of person steps out when the meeting ends. If the answer is kinder neighbor, steadier worker, braver friend, and cleaner account, then the room has paid its rent. If the answer is smaller soul and sharper elbow, then no emblem can save it. The true test of any secret society is the daylight it sends back into the street. Thank you for watching and for spending time with this exploration. Please like the video and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. Your support means a great deal to this community. See you in the next video.